Chapter 14, Looking Backward. 2 months after all of these experiences, around mid-May of 1971, I was moved to try to sum up the particularly bizarre and possibly physics-compromising incidents that I could then recall. Here is what I wrote at that time, a time when I was concerned to refute the idea that schizophrenia was a magic word explaining all that we had undergone. I have almost 2 months' perspective on the events surrounding our experiments at La Chirera, and though I can clearly recognize that both myself and my brother evinced the classic symptomatology associated with the two generally distinguished categories of process schizophrenia, I am unable to make the assumption that our experiment was therefore nothing but two simultaneously occurring instances of schizophrenia. Rather, and with the full knowledge that such a position argues that I may still be experiencing residual symptoms of the illness, I maintain that we were in fact dealing with an objective phenomenon that, though of a highly peculiar nature, inexorably bound up with psychic processes, does have its basis in the molecular ideas we were in the process of investigating. As empirical evidence of this viewpoint, I mention the following points which seem to me to set our experiment outside the realm of mental illness. The suddenness with which the symptoms developed following our actual experiment. Within a few minutes after we completed our pre-planned experimental procedures, my brother began to disengage himself from the continuum of shared perceptions, and at this same time I underwent a willing suspension of disbelief and began to experience the cybernetic unit that we had predicted would be a part of the effect we would cause if we were successful in our attempt to generate a superconducting genetic matrix harmine bond. The integrated or dovetail aspect of our shared disassociation, meaning that, though both of us were experiencing the symptoms of types of schizophrenia, the fantasy, the ideas, and the understanding which we were experiencing were shared, so that while my brother thought of me as the shaman messiah in all manifestations, I perceived him as the condensed mind lens making a return journey across the universe that might have been one logical outcome of our experiment. Each of us alone would have given the clear appearance of being deluded. However, each of us seemed to offer elusive proof of the correctness of the position of the other. I might add that though no one else could understand my brother's peculiar mental processes, I believed I could discern depth and an integrated understanding which seemed to be behind them. But at the same time, I understood that his apparent lack of integration was due to the fact that his thinking was moving backward in some fundamental way. In the same way that a film running in reverse seems to present a spectacle of wild and irrational confusion, yet manages in the end to have things in their proper places, my brother's ideas and physical movement seemed to me to be simply the exact reverse of logical expectations. Knowing that the brain seems to operate on the principle of a hologram, Dennis had speculated before our experiment that he might receive a reverse image of my brain-mind organization for a brief time during the experiment. In listening to his free associations after the reversal, I became certain that this had in fact occurred, but for a much longer time than we had anticipated. In fact, I still believe that our only error throughout this entire experiment and the events following it has been our inability to correctly predict the duration of the process. I believe that our understanding of the mechanisms of the process, aside from its duration, have been correct, though still incomplete. Time is still, in other words, the crux of this matter. At times, my brother's free associations consisted of incidents which I had experienced more than a year previously and more than 10,000 miles from where Dennis was then living, incidents about which I had spoken to no one. Dennis seemed to possess the ability to hear my mind working during the time after the experiment. I illustrate by recalling an incident when I was sitting outside of our jungle hut listening to his free associations, having noticed a few minutes before that his muscles were almost rigid with the enormous physical energy associated with some types of schizophrenia. I worried that he might at some future time resist my efforts to keep him from wandering away on his archetypal errands, which constantly motivated him to try to leave our immediate living area. It occurred to me that with such strength he could easily injure me or perhaps escape. While mulling this disturbing possibility for the first time, I noticed that Dennis had left his hammock and was standing in the doorway of the hut. In a perfect imitation of our father's voice, he consoled me with the spoken thought that Dennis is a good lad and would never do a thing like that. Another incident occurred 7 days after the reversal began. Dennis announced that at 11 o'clock that night, the good shit would appear. This was a reference to a kind of psilocybin-enriched hashish that Dennis claimed he had encountered a few months before leaving the States. This prediction of a material transmutation is not so odd when the alchemical concerns and ideas which led us into this experiment are recalled. After this conversation, Ev and I returned to the forest house for the night, and Dennis stayed at the river house. As was our custom, we smoked a bit of the local marijuana before turning in. During this process, a small fragment fell, still burning, from the pipe, and as I picked it up to return it to the pipe, the characteristic odor of Asian hashish was very noticeable. I examined the pipe very carefully, and though no change in the physical appearance of the smoking mixture had occurred, it was now definitely, to my own satisfaction and that of skeptical Ev, behaving exactly like hashish, a drug absolutely unknown in the Amazon in 1971. This phenomenon persisted for about 5 minutes and then slowly faded, leaving us to the rational continuum of normal behavior of materials. It is to be regretted that this transmutation occurred with a substance where any skeptic will be at ease in venting his scorn. We are all familiar with the facile view that potheads can't think straight. But to anyone with in-depth involvement with these two substances, the difference is unmistakable. This experience contained a number of parallels to the Njuli movement among the Lawangan people of Borneo, who in the early 1920s promulgated ideas centering around the claim that a piece of resin had suddenly become longer through the influence of a flute played nearby, and that the lengthening of the resin foreshadowed human immortality. Equally absurd and equally inexplicable was an incident that occurred on the morning of the 5th day. Dennis was sitting raving to no one in particular, with the normal camp life going on around him. I was sitting near the cooking fire, sharpening the expedition's buck knife. I listened while Dennis raved, scanning his ramblings for a hint of a message. Suddenly, I stopped my work. "Are you my tailor?" This in a strong English accent. That seemed familiar to me from somewhere. "All these reflections, see? It's me. But where is my tailor, my silly? Look at you. Why, you've got my knickers on." I blushed deeply. I looked at the ground and said nothing. I felt very boxed in. Dennis was imitating the conversation I had had with my little English friend after I had come looking for her and returned with her delirious to my room in Nepal more than a year before. The crazy conversation between she and I that I had never discussed with anyone save her was now booming out over our Amazon clearing in the mad voice of my brother. It was hardly the sort of situation in which I wanted to exalt his prowess as a telepath. I said nothing and waited squirming for his raving to drift off into incoherence. but I was impressed and convinced that he had somehow been able to completely penetrate not only my thought, but my nearly self-forgotten private memories. Most important among the features arguing more than a simple case of simultaneous schizophrenia is the idea model we have created out of the careful observation of things which happen to us. No one can argue that our theory of the hyperspatial nature of hallucinogenic drug states and the experiment we devised to test that theory yielded not only spectacular results, but a wave-particle theory of the nature of time. We took that theory and were able to construe it, using the energy maps of the I Ching, into a demonstrable idea that within its own terms explicates the nature of time and space. We turned an intuition into an idea model which explains the interconnection of physical and psychological phenomena from the submolecular level to the macrocosmic. Was this simply a creative outburst, or was it part of a close encounter with the UFO enigma? After the first mushroom experience at La Chorrera, we were involved with two ideas in particular. These were the motif of the teacher and the insect motif. Dennis and I could feel the overwhelming presence of some unseen intelligent entity which seemed to be observing and sometimes exerting influence in the situation to keep us moving gently toward a breakthrough. Because of the bizarre nature of the DMT flash, with its seeming stress upon themes alien, insectile, and interstellar, we were led to speculate that the nature of the teacher was somehow that of a diplomat anthropologist come to give us the keys to galactarian citizenship. We discussed this entity in terms of a giant insect, and through the insect trill of the Amazon jungle at midday, we seemed to be able to discern a deeper harmonic buzz that was the signal keying us to the entity in hyperspace. This sense of the presence of an alien third party was sometimes very intense, most intense from March 5th to 10th, and from there fading off gradually. This image of the insect teacher gave rise to numerous entomological speculations. We thought at the time that the process we were involved with was something like the process of giving birth to a child, but also much like the metamorphosis that occurs in the life cycle of insects, especially Coleoptera and Lepidoptera. We knew that tryptamine was somehow a major part of the solution to the enzymal mysteries surrounding metamorphosis, recalling certain unconfirmed reports of the grub of a Coleoptera species of eastern Brazil eaten by Indians there for the hallucinatory effect, noting that diffraction of the spectrum of visible light as it occurs in natural phenomena such as rainbows, peacock feathers, certain insects, and the colors that appear on the surfaces of some metals during heating are all persistent motifs within the stages of the alchemical opus. In fact, the cau de pavones, the peacock's tail, is the brief stage which heralds the final whitening. By exotic intuition, I knew that the occurrence of such interface colors in nature indicated the presence of tryptamine-related compounds. Going further, I knew that the Lepidopterus New World genus Morphoia, which is characterized by a large wing area, usually entirely expressed in brilliant blue interphase coloration, would be an ideal group upon which to conduct research to illuminate this unstudied field. I knew that the enzymal process in insect metamorphosis received molecular tuning and control through resonation induced by the harmonic strum of forest insects that have neuroactive tryptamine in their bodies, acting for them as an antenna to the electron spin resonance signal of the collective DNA, just as it did for us in the experiment. This signal would, I thought, keep the entire class Insecta keyed in to the point of maximum symmetry in the evolutionary stream, thus explaining the remarkable durability of the insect adaptation, which stabilized its basic evolutionary strategy some hundreds of millions of years ago. Such things I was told quite conversationally by the voice in my mind. During this time, the iridescent black sheen which resulted when Stropharia cubensis grew in clumps and larger mushrooms shed spores on the caps of smaller mushrooms particularly caught my eye. Interestingly enough, this same metallic blue-black sheen was very noticeably present on the carapace of a large and shrill beetle, a member of the genus Buprestidae that I captured in the forest in the heat of the afternoon. It is known that the chitinous material which forms the outer covering of insects and spores is one of the most electron-dense materials in organic nature, being in this property similar to metals. My inner teacher urged that this specimen be analyzed for the presence of psychoactive tryptamines. If they were found, it would tend to confirm that the species responsible for the buzz of the forest, the coleoptera and the cicadas, will in some species be found to contain the tryptamine compound necessary to allow them to key in on harmine present in local Banisteriopsis lianas and through them to the collective DNA network. I suppose that if a few of these species resonate, then other shrilling species could key themselves to the molecular signal, thus amplifying it and sustaining it through the forest for some hours of every day. Some of the life processes of the insecta, I felt sure, must be regulated through a few species in this way. These unlikely and bizarre ideas unfolded themselves over those long, hot days while Dennis lay confined to his hammock and I squatted on the earth nearby. By the third or fourth day, I had learned enough of the new and peculiarly symbolic language that he was speaking that I was more and more convinced that through it I could observe him making a gradual but progressive integration. Often then long silences would fall between the raves, and we would each drift off into a world of private reveries. Several times on such occasions I looked down and noticed with a weird thrill that my unconscious fingers had been engaged in gathering small twigs and arranging them in patterns as though they were to be miniature fires. This unconscious laying of small fires by my busy fingers seemed to me most extraordinary. It was interpreted then as a literal overflowing of the organizing energies that were being poured into me from some unknown source, the same source that was supplying me with energy so that I could matter-of-factly eliminate the need for sleep. Occasionally Dennis would interrupt me to ask that I or Ev smoke a cigarette for him. Questioning uncovered his belief that in hyperspace the topology of all human bodies is continuous, and so he could just absorb what he needed directly out of our bodies. For 5 days life went on in that mode, with us sending amazingly few waves of interaction out into the real world around us. The morning of the 10th of March changed that. I had hardly been away from the hut and the short stretch of trail that separated it from the edge of the pasture for 5 days. So after breakfast on that particularly flawless morning, I chatted with Dennis and found him calmer and more lucid than he had been since the experiment. So composed and relaxed did he seem that I made the inevitable mistake of taking the situation for granted. I slipped away with Ev and the butterfly net for a relaxed stroll down the trail and deeper into the jungle. We were gone scarcely 40 minutes, but returned to the hut and the clearing to find them humming with a deserted air of emptiness that was heart-sinking. I was not afraid that Dennis would wander into the forest and become lost, as I was convinced that whatever his state of mind, it did not include that sort of thing. What I did fear was that he might focus others' attention on us and the borderline areas that we were investigating. Leaving Ev at the camp, I ran to the pasture and across it to the mission on the far side. As I ran, I was busy telling myself that he would probably just have gone down to see Dave and Vanessa, and that I would, of course, find him there. I was too preoccupied to notice that the bells of the mission, silent normally except on Sundays, had been pealing for some time. As I came over the rise that gave me a clear view of the river house and the lake below the Choro, I saw Vanessa leading Dennis toward the river house. I could sense that the situation was more difficult than I had hoped. Vanessa was angry and had seized the situation to drive home her point. It seemed that Dennis must have bolted from his hammock the moment that Ev and I passed out of sight. He had gone straight to the mission, located the bell rope of the bell used to call the people to Mass, and had rung it furiously until the priest had found Vanessa and Dave, and they had none too gently persisted him to desist. Nevertheless, the already circulating rumor that one of our expedition had gone a bit off the deep end was not eroded by this sudden and totally public outrage. The delicate political balance I had established that had allowed me to have my way in the matter of treatment for Dennis was destroyed. Now Vanessa's idea that he should be moved to the river house was brought forth and endorsed by the priests and, I was told, by the police. Riding on the inner assurance that worry is preposterous, and seeing that I had completely lost control of the situation, I agreed to all suggestions. Vanessa had more news. An airplane was coming. It was not coming to take us out, but it would enable us to begin our withdrawal, since it would allow one of us to get a lift over 100 kilometers of jungle to San Rafael, where we had left the cache of equipment before making the overland march to La Chorrera. This was the only opportunity to fly rather than walk back to those supplies, and Vanessa pressed that we should take advantage of it. I agreed with everything. I assumed that soon the eruption of the millennium would obviate all such mundane concerns, but that was a fact that I would leave others to discover for themselves as they made their way into the ever-deepening dimension of the future. Dave had volunteered to go on the airplane. The decision was made almost at a moment's notice. He would reach our supplies and single-handedly undertake to have them and himself shipped up the Rio Putumayo and then back to Bogota. We would meet him back there when and if we got out by some means not yet clear. A bag was hastily packed. The airplane came skimming in, and then it was gone again, and we were 4. Vanessa and Ev became Dennis's nurses. He was moved to the river house, and I preferred to continue to live at the jungle house to avoid crowding. Dave was gone. The debate continued as to whether the direction in Dennis' raving was toward improvement, or whether it was only progressive drifting in the world in which he had become lost. Dennis' move to the river was a turning point, and from then hence the effects of the phenomenon unleashed were less in our minds and more in the world. Through it all, we were still after the lens-shaped object. What the teacher told me in the first few days after the experiment was, "You almost got it. You didn't quite get it." Or rather, it used the metaphor of condensation. It is condensing. It was like a perfect alchemical metaphor. The stone is everywhere. It is here. Dennis would say, "I can see it. It's 250 feet away, to the left, down near the water hole, hovering above the water." Each day it would get closer in. There were freak lightning storms. Slowly I noticed that meteorological phenomena tended to concentrate in the southeast. I began to look there, and whenever I did, I would see rainbows. Intuitions concerning what was going on ranged from the religiously profound to the utterly absurd. On the afternoon of the 12th of March, Dennis underwent a few hours when he was able to respond, however cryptically, to the questions we put to him concerning how things appeared to him. This all went on at the river house, and it happened that living around that house was a handsome rooster and his mate. He was perhaps the very cock that I had heard crow at dawn on the day of the experiment, and again 2 days thereafter. There was a perky alertness about this cock and hen that had received comment among us before. This particular afternoon, Dennis called our attention to the little hen, saying that if one thought of her as art, then the achievement she represented was immense. Who could make such a hen? Only the one who could have fashioned the peculiar world that we had fallen into, and that one is James Joyce. Over the next few minutes he proceeded to make his case that Finnegan's Wake represented the most complete understanding of the relation of the human mind to the time and space around it, and that, therefore, Joyce, at his death, had somehow been shouldered with the responsibilities of overseeing this part of God's universe. In this, Dennis was only following Wyndham Lewis, who made Joyce's ascent to eminence in the afterworld the subject of his novel, The Human Age. Jim and Nora, as Dennis called the newly revealed deity and his consort, were in and through everything at La Chorrera, particularly in the things that Joyce had loved. The little hen, as the symbol of Anna Livia Pluribel of the Wake, was one of these things. It was Joycean humor that radiated outward from the path that he had followed. These ideas were absurd but delightful, and they led me eventually to reread Joyce and to accept him as one of the true pioneers in the mapping of hyperspace. They did not, however, shed much light on our predicament. From that view of life as literature, Dennis moved on. He reminded me that one of the alchemical analogues for the philosopher's stone that we shared in our private code of associations was a certain small silver key, a key to a box of inlaid wood with a secret compartment that had belonged to our maternal grandfather. I said that the ability to produce that key, which had been lost since our childhood, would prove the reality of Dennis' shamanic powers and their ability to materially transcend normal space and time. The conversation took the form of a question-and-answer session that ended with Dennis demanding that I hold out my hand, and then slapping his closed hand into my open one, letting out a loud, ludicrous squawk, and depositing in my palm a small silver key.
Then would you be convinced? Well, look at this!
At the time, I was thunderstruck. We were hundreds of miles from anywhere. The key before me was indistinguishable from the key of my childhood memories. Had he saved that key over all those years to produce it now in the middle of the Amazon to completely distort my notion of reality? Or was this only a similar key that Dennis had been carrying when he arrived in South America, but that I had somehow not noticed until he produced it? This seemed unlikely. He was confined to a room far from our stored equipment, and it was difficult to conceive of him becoming calm and organized enough to go to the baggage and carefully sort through it to the secreted key. This matter of the silver key, whether it was the original key or where it had come from, has never been satisfactorily settled. The original box was lost long ago, so the key was never tested. A final ironic note is added to the story by the fact that both Dennis and I were fans of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, and so were aware of his story, Through the Gates of the Silver Key, a tale seething with many dimensions, strange beings, and a cosmic time scale. After Dennis had moved to reside in the river house, there was no longer any need for my sleepless watch at night, but the lack of a need to sleep prevailed. I actually looked forward each day to the time when everyone would retire, and I would have before me long hours of delicious silent thought. Like the fox spirit of the I Ching who wanders eternally among the jeweled night grasses, I wandered in the pastures and on the trails around La Chorrera. Sometimes I would sit beneath the Ama-initialed tree for hours, watching vast mandalas of space and time turn and glisten around me. At times I would walk long strides, nearly loping, head thrown back, gazing at the every-colored stars. Effortlessly, the deeper something that shared my mind connected up the constellations for me and showed me the enormous zodiacal machine that must have come to the ancients with the same suggestive force. Understanding in the form of immersion in millions of images of mankind in all times and places, struggling with the insoluble enigma of being and human destiny. It was during those velvet, star-strewn jungle nights that I felt closest to understanding the tripartite mystery of the philosopher's stone, the UFO, and the human soul. There is something human that transcends the individual and that transcends life and death as well. It has will, motive, and enormous power. Under certain conditions, the manipulative power of consciousness moves beyond the body and into the world. The world then obeys the will of consciousness to the degree that the inertia of pre-existing physical laws can be overcome. This inertia is overcome by consciousness determining the outcome of the normally random microphysical events. Over time, the deflection of microphysical events from randomness is cumulative, so that eventually the effects of such deflections are to shift the course of events in larger physical systems as well. Therefore, the greater the amount of time consciousness has in which to make its effects felt, the greater the possibility becomes that the willed end will come to pass, as subtle pressure toward a given end accomplishes the series of micro-deviations eventuating in a non-random and anti-entropic situation. The secret, in short, of falling in love. Consciousness works the same way within the brain, but there matter and energy are in a more unbound and dynamic state than throughout the rest of nature. It is easy for consciousness to direct the electrical flow in the central nervous system, though we have no idea how this is done. It is less easy for it to move not electrons, but whole atomic systems spread far and wide in time and space. This may explain why it is easier to form a thought, but having one's wishes come true takes longer. There is an interphase between consciousness active in the world and consciousness active in the CNS and through the intermediary of the body. That interphase is language. In using language, consciousness informs the brain to inform the body, to impart to the random motion of the air molecules near but outside the body a coherency. This coherency is supplied by consciousness in the form of a word. None of the physical laws operating on the air molecules have been violated because the coherent pattern of behavior of the molecules is due to an input of energy whose release was initiated by an act of conscious will. Language is thereby seen to be a kind of parapsychological ability, since it involves action at a distance and telekinesis, albeit voice transduced. Perhaps under the influence of psilocybin, an immense energizing of will could be vocally transduced into the world and do more than imprint a signal onto the random motion of air molecules. Perhaps instead a sign, visibly beheld, might be transduced and appear through appropriate shifts of refraction in those same nearby air molecules. Normal speech itself is sometimes seen to affect the refractive index of the air in front of the speaker's mouth. Perhaps this is an indication of the hidden potential of speech to go beyond its normal function of symbolizing reality to actually signifying it. A more perfect logos would seem to be the result, a logos able to regulate the activity of the ego as it exists in the sum total of the individuals living at any time. It is like a god. It is the human god. It is something that will happen to human destiny sometime in the future, and because it will happen, it is happening. Nothing is unannounced, and the ontological mode of the higher dimensions into which humanity is being propelled is being anticipated by the singularity which we call the UFO. Vallée is correct. The UFO is teaching something through its reinforcement schedule. It is preparing us to confront the God facet of ourselves that our explorations into the nature of life and matter are about to reveal.
Med Mikael.